You've heard of the Hundred Years' War, but what if I told you that it wasn't really about England versus France? What if behind every battle, every royal claim, and every fallen knight, there was a deeper struggle, one for identity, power, and the birth of modern nations themselves? Today, we're uncovering the real story behind the war that shaped Europe forever. 7 generations, 5 kings, one endless war. For over 100 years, England and France weren't just enemies, they were rivals for destiny itself. But was this war really about who owned the French crown, or something far more revolutionary? Every war begins with a spark. But this one, the 100 Years' War, didn't start with a sword being drawn or a castle being attacked. It began in silence in royal chambers filled with whispers, betrayal, and pride. To understand why 2 of the most powerful kingdoms in medieval Europe, England and France, would battle for over a century, we have to go back to the roots. Back to a single question that would divide nations for generations. Who truly had the right to wear the French crown? It's the early 1300s. Europe is a continent of shifting loyalties and fragile peace. England and France are not yet the nations we know today. They weave webs of feudal alliances, held together by bloodlines, marriages, and ambition. And in this web sat 2 families so intertwined that their destiny was bound to clash. For centuries, English kings held lands inside France. Through inheritance, conquest, and marriage, they ruled not just as kings of England, but as powerful dukes under the French crown. It was a strange, almost absurd relationship. The King of England, technically a vassal to the King of France. Imagine that. One monarch kneeling before another, both pretending to respect the balance while secretly dreaming of breaking it. By the 1320s, tensions were already high. Trade disputes, border raids, and pride kept the relationship fragile. But everything changed when France's King Charles IV died in 1328 and left behind no sons, no clear heir. The French throne, one of the most coveted in Europe, suddenly stood empty. And that's when ambition began to whisper in royal ears. Charles IV was the last of the direct Capetian kings, a dynasty that had ruled France for over 300 years. According to French custom, the crown should pass to the closest male relative. But here's where the bloodlines got complicated and dangerous. Charles had no brothers left alive. His closest male relative, his nephew, Edward III of England, the son of Charles's sister, Isabella of France, known in England as the Chivalry of France. Edward's claim was legitimate by blood. His mother was the daughter of a French king, but in France, the powerful nobles and legal scholars argued otherwise. They invoked an old law, or rather, a custom, that would change everything, the Talic law, this ancient Frankish code for bad succession through the female line. In their eyes, a woman could not inherit the throne, and therefore neither could her son. So, instead of Edward, the French nobility turned to another candidate, Philip of Valois, Charles IV's cousin. He was French-born, raised in Paris, loyal to the French court, and most importantly, not a foreign king. The nobles crowned him Philip VI of France in 1328. For a time, Edward accepted this. He was young, barely 16, when his claim was denied, and his own throne in England was not yet secure. But beneath the surface, resentment grew. He was a proud king, and more than that, he believed his right had been stolen. Still, for several years, he played along with France's decision, bowing to Philip's authority as his overlord for the lands he still held in Aquitaine, a rich region in southwestern France. But power never stays still for long. As the years passed, cracks began to show. Philip VI, now King of France, demanded heavier taxes and tighter control over Edward's territories in France. Edward, in turn, resisted, seeing these demands as insults to his sovereignty. And when Philip seized control of Gascony in 1337, one of Edward's most valuable provinces, the final thread snapped. Edward retaliated in the only way a medieval king could. He claimed the French crown outright. No more playing the vassal. No more pretending. In 1340, he formally declared himself the rightful king of France, and his banners bore a new symbol, the fleur-de-lis of France, placed alongside the lions of England. That declaration wasn't just political, it was personal. It was a statement of identity, of defiance, and of pride. And with that, the stage was set for war. But this wasn't just about who would rule France. This was about what it meant to rule, about the very nature of kingship in medieval Europe. You see, in this age, the concept of a nation didn't yet exist as we know it. People didn't think of themselves as English or French. They were loyal to their lords, to their regions, to the church. But as the banners of England and France began to face each other on the battlefield, something deeper began to take shape, the idea of national identity. But in 1337, none of that was clear yet. All that mattered was pride and power. Edward III saw a stolen crown. Philip VI saw a rebellious vassal who needed to be punished, and so began a conflict that neither man could control. What's fascinating is that neither side truly wanted a century of war. Both kings believed victory would be swift, one great battle to decide it all. But the Middle Ages had other plans. What started as a dispute between two royal cousins would unravel into generations of bloodshed, with sons fighting wars their fathers had started, and grandsons paying the price for ancient grudges. Even in those early years, the war wasn't fought only with swords. It was fought through diplomacy, marriage alliances, and propaganda. Edward declared himself the rightful heir by God's will, while Philip claimed to defend the order of France. Each side portrayed the other as a usurper. It became not just a dynastic struggle, but a moral one, each kingdom claiming divine favor. And in the middle of all this, the people, the farmers, the merchants, the soldiers who had no stake in royal bloodlines, but would lose everything because of them. Villages burned, trade collapsed, and Europe slid into a century of instability. By the late 1330s, the first battles had already erupted, raids across the Channel. Naval clashes and sieges that would mark the start of one of the longest, most devastating wars in human history. But the heart of it, the origin, always remained the same: a broken line of succession, a rejected claim, and two kings who refused to kneel. Because in the end, the 100 Years' War wasn't born out of conquest. It was born out of pride, out of a question that no one could answer without blood: who truly owned the right to rule France? When we imagine the 100 Years' War, we picture a single, endless conflict, knights charging through muddy fields, banners waving, and kings roaring commands. But that's the myth. The truth is far more complex. The 100 Years' War wasn't one long war. It was a series of wars, interruptions, truces, betrayals, and restarts, a storm that refused to die. It was a century-long rhythm of ambition and exhaustion, where peace was only the pause between two battles. After Edward III of England claimed the French throne, the early years were filled with fire and thunder. But the war didn't follow a straight line. It came in waves. There were moments when England seemed unstoppable, sweeping through France like a force of nature, and moments when France struck back with vengeance and pride. Each generation inherited not peace, but unfinished hatred. By the mid-1300s, the war had already started to reveal its strange nature, not just about land or crowns, but about endurance. Both kingdoms were testing the limits of how long they could fight, how much they could spend, and how deeply they could believe that victory was still possible. And the people, caught in between, were realizing that this was not the chivalric war sung by poets. This was survival. The first great phase of the war, under Edward III, began with a shock to France. England's armies were small, but disciplined, and used tactics the French weren't ready for. They brought longbows instead of heavy armor, strategy instead of bravado. In 1346, at the Battle of Crécy, Edward's forces shattered a much larger French army. Arrows rained down like steel storms, cutting through knights who thought themselves invincible. It was the end of the age of chivalry and the birth of modern warfare. Then came Calais, the gateway to France. Edward captured it in 1347 after a brutal siege that lasted almost a year. Calais became England's foothold on the continent, a scar that wouldn't heal for centuries. But then something happened that neither army could fight, a silent enemy that would kill more soldiers than any battle ever could: the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, the plague swept through Europe, killing millions, emptying towns, and silencing even the drums of war. For a time, both England and France fell quiet. their fields filled not with soldiers but with graves. When the war resumed, it had changed. So had the kings who fought it. In 1356, Edward's son, the famous Black Prince, led the English at the Battle of Poitiers. Once again, the French were defeated. Their king, John II, was captured and taken to England in chains. It was humiliation on a royal scale. France seemed broken. England controlled huge swaths of its territory, and for a moment, Edward III's dream of ruling both nations looked within reach. But as always, dreams fade faster than they form. The French didn't surrender, they adapted, they reorganized. Under the leadership of Charles V, the wise and patient king, France began to recover. He avoided direct battles, choosing instead to use strategy and attrition. He focused on taking back castles, controlling trade, and slowly bleeding the English forces dry. This wasn't the romantic war of gallant knights. This was chess played with lives. By the 1370s, the tide had turned again. England, once dominant, was now stretched thin. The war had drained its treasury and its people's patience. Armies cost money and kings needed taxes. And every coin sent to the front meant another farmer starving at home. France regained most of its lost lands, and for a time, peace, or something like it, settled over Europe. But it was only a surface calm. The war wasn't over. It was simply waiting. You see, that's the true nature of the 100 Years' War. It wasn't a story with a beginning and end. It was an inheritance of conflict, passed from father to son, from king to king. When one generation grew tired, the next picked up the sword again. Edward III died, his empire unfinished. His son, the Black Prince, died young, leaving a child to inherit the crown, Richard II. France too would face its own chaos, with nobles fighting among themselves for power. And that's where the second storm began. By the early 1400s, England was again under a warrior king, Henry V, bold, charismatic, ruthless. He saw what his ancestors had failed to complete and believed he could finish it. In 1415, he launched a daring invasion of France. The campaign was brutal, but his victory at Agincourt became legend. Outnumbered, exhausted, yet unstoppable, Henry's army destroyed the French knights with the deadly precision of the longbow. France seemed cursed to repeat its defeats. After Agincourt, Henry marched through Normandy, conquering city after city. By 1420, through the Treaty of Troyes, he achieved what Edward III had only dreamed of. The French king Charles VI recognized him as heir to the French throne. For a moment, it looked as though the crowns of England and France would finally unite. But once again, history refused to cooperate. Henry died suddenly in 1422, leaving his infant son as king of both nations. The dream shattered before it could become real. The French, led by Charles VII and inspired by a mysterious young woman, Joan of Arc, rose again. Under her divine vision, they reclaimed their spirit, their pride, and their lands. The English victories unraveled, their morale broken, their soldiers weary from decades of endless war. And that's what makes the 100 Years' War so unique. It was never truly won or lost in a single moment. It was a pendulum swinging endlessly between triumph and despair. One king would rise, another would fall. Territories would change hands, then change again. Generations were born into a world where war was normal, not an event, but a condition of life. This was not a war of conquest anymore. It had become a war of existence. It defined what it meant to be English or French. The people began to see themselves not as subjects of a feudal lord, but as part of something larger, a kingdom, a nation, an identity. And every time the war reignited, it burned that identity deeper into their hearts. Because the 100 Years' War wasn't about one battle or one treaty. It was about a century of shifting loyalties, of hope and heartbreak, of kings chasing crowns that crumbled in their hands. It was a living cycle of ambition, pride, and survival that no truce could truly silence. There's something strange about the 100 Years' War, something that separates it from every medieval conflict that came before. It wasn't only fought with swords, bows, and cannons. It was fought with words, symbols, and beliefs. This was a war of identity, of propaganda, of stories told to shape reality itself. Behind every charge on the battlefield was another battle, one waged for the hearts and minds of people who would never set foot on the front lines. Because in the 14th and 15th centuries, power didn't come from armies alone. It came from meaning. Kings ruled by divine right, yes, but that divine right had to be believed in. It had to be felt by the people. Every king who claimed a throne needed to prove not only his strength but his legitimacy, his purpose. And when Edward III of England declared himself the rightful king of France, he didn't just start a war, he started a competition over truth itself. From the very first declarations, both England and France crafted their own narratives. Edward III claimed he was the rightful heir through his mother, Isabella of France, the daughter of a French king. He painted his claim as lawful, divinely sanctioned, and just. His message was simple: France belongs to me by blood and by God's will. Philip VI of France, on the other hand, declared that Edward's claim violated sacred French custom. He framed Edward as an outsider, a foreign invader pretending to be French. And in a world where national identity was just beginning to form, that accusation cut deep. Propaganda in the Middle Ages didn't look like newspapers or posters. It spread through proclamations read aloud in marketplaces, through songs sung by minstrels, and through the pulpit, the voice of the church. Kings understood that religion was the amplifier of power. If the church stood behind you, your war became holy. If it opposed you, it became sin. So both Edward and Philip courted priests, bishops, and scholars to bless their cause. Chroniclers, the medieval journalists, became weapons of war. Men like Jean Froissart, who wrote vivid accounts of battles and kings, often tailored their words to glorify one side and vilify the other. History in this age was not recorded, it was constructed. Every story told was a piece of the puzzle that shaped how future generations would remember the war. But propaganda wasn't limited to the highborn. It seeped into the lives of ordinary people. English merchants were told they fought to protect trade and God's justice. French peasants were told they were defending their homeland from invaders. Over time, these ideas began to form something new, the earliest sparks of national pride. The word English began to mean more than a subject of a king. It began to mean someone who belonged to a land, a culture, a people. The same transformation was happening across the Channel in France. What's fascinating is how this identity war evolved with each generation. In England, victories like Crecy and Agincourt were transformed into national legends. They weren't just battles, they were proof that England was chosen, that their longbows and discipline made them a people favored by fate. Plays, poems, and ballads celebrated these moments, turning them into symbols of divine favor. English soldiers began to believe they were fighting not for Edward or Henry alone, but for the very soul of their country. Meanwhile, in France, something equally powerful was happening. Every loss deepened a sense of unity. Every humiliation, the occupation of cities, the capture of kings, planted the seed of collective resilience. France began to define itself not by victory, but by endurance. The people clung to the belief that God had not abandoned them, that their suffering was a test, not a curse. And then came Joan of Arc, the embodiment of French propaganda made flesh. She wasn't a noble or a scholar or a general. She was a peasant girl who claimed to hear the voice of God telling her to drive out the English. Whether divine miracle or psychological phenomenon, her presence reshaped the entire narrative of the war. She became a living symbol, the face of faith, purity, and patriotism. When Joan rode into battle wearing armor and carrying her white banner, she wasn't just leading soldiers. She was leading a story. Her victories, especially the lifting of the siege of Orleans, were seen as divine proof that France was chosen by God. The English, who had dominated the war for decades, suddenly found themselves painted as heretics, invaders, and villains in a moral drama they could no longer control. Even after Joan's capture and execution, her legend only grew stronger. The French crown used her image to unify a fractured nation. Her death became martyrdom. Her story, retold in sermons and chronicles, transformed despair into hope. Through her, France didn't just fight back, it believed again. That's the essence of the propaganda war, belief as a weapon. The English claimed God's favor with victories. The French claimed it through endurance and redemption. Both sides needed to see themselves as righteous, because the alternative, that they were fighting for pride and power, was unbearable. Symbols became as powerful as armies. The fleur-de-lis, once just a royal emblem, turned into a national symbol of divine protection. The English lion, fierce and proud, became a badge of defiance. Heraldry, banners, even coins were part of this visual battlefield, carrying messages of faith, unity, and legitimacy. Every color, every emblem, every motto was another thread in the tapestry of identity that was being woven through war. And beneath all of it, something irreversible was happening. The old medieval world, where loyalty was to lords and not lands, was breaking apart. People began to see their king as the embodiment of their country. They began to feel what it meant to belong. Out of centuries of propaganda and pride, out of songs and sermons, a new kind of loyalty was being born, not feudal, but national. The 100 Years' War didn't just change borders, it changed minds. It created the language of belonging, of us and them, and once people started to see themselves as part of something greater than their lord's domain, the world could never go back to what it was before. Because in the shadow of swords and the echo of battles, another, quieter war was being fought, a war for the story itself. For who would define truth, who would define God's will, and who would decide what it truly meant to be a nation? Every great war creates its heroes, men and women who seem larger than life, whose names echo through the centuries. But in the 100 Years' War, these figures were more than just warriors. They became symbols, living, breathing embodiments of destiny, power, and faith. Their stories were shaped by blood and battle, yes, but also by politics, myth, and the desperate need of kings and nations to believe in something greater than themselves. Among the first to rise into legend was Edward the Black Prince. He was the son of Edward III of England, young, fierce, and born for war. His armor, blackened not by soot but by choice, became a symbol of fear and glory across Europe. At only 16, he commanded troops at the Battle of Crecy, where English archers cut down the flower of French chivalry. The boy became a man that day, and the man became a myth. Chroniclers wrote of his courage, his calm under fire, his grace in victory. He fought not as a king, but as a knight, the perfect image of medieval valor. But legends have two faces. The same war that made him famous also hardened him. The Black Prince could be merciful, but he could also be merciless. In 1355, his forces burned and pillaged southern France in a campaign known as the Savoy, a brutal, scorched earth march meant to cripple the enemy's will to fight. Thousands of villages were destroyed, crops torched, people slaughtered. For the English, it was strategy. For the French, it was terror. Yet through this violence, his legend only grew. To his soldiers, he was unstoppable, the dark star of English triumph. Then came Henry V, the king who turned war into theater. He was everything a medieval ruler aspired to be: disciplined, devout, brilliant in battle. When he took the throne in 1413, England was weary and divided. But Henry had a vision. He believed the war with France could unite his fractured kingdom. He needed not just victory, but spectacle, something that would burn England's pride into eternity. In 1415, he launched his campaign. The odds were impossible, his army small and exhausted. Yet at Agincourt, Henry achieved the unthinkable. Mud, rain, and longbows turned French nobility into corpses. Thousands of armored knights were cut down by a handful of English soldiers. It wasn't just a military victory. It was a miracle, or so the story was told. Henry became a legend overnight. Chroniclers compared him to biblical kings chosen by God to bring justice. In his speeches, he didn't just rally soldiers, he ignited a sense of destiny, but Henry was more than a commander. He was a performer. He understood that kingship wasn't just about ruling, it was about appearing to rule by divine will. Every gesture, every prayer before battle, every word to his men was carefully crafted to make him seem not just a man, but a vessel of purpose. Agincourt wasn't just fought with arrows, it was fought with faith. The French, humiliated once again, fell into despair. Their king, Charles VI, was plagued by madness. The country fractured into rival factions. It seemed that France itself was collapsing until something extraordinary happened. Out of the chaos rose a figure unlike any the world had seen before. A peasant girl from Domremy. 17 years old, illiterate. Claiming to hear the voice of God, Joan of Arc, her arrival on the stage of history changed everything. She appeared at a moment when France had lost hope, when defeat seemed inevitable. She walked into the court of the Dauphin, the future Charles VII, and declared that God had chosen her to lead France to victory. Imagine that. A teenage girl standing before skeptical nobles and hardened soldiers, speaking with the certainty of prophecy. At first, they laughed, then they listened, and then they followed her. When Joan rode into battle wearing shining armor and carrying her white banner marked with the names of Jesus and Mary, she wasn't just a warrior, she was a vision. Her presence turned chaos into conviction. Men who had lost everything now believed again. Her faith was contagious, unshakable, radiant, terrifying. In 1429, she led the French to a stunning victory at Orleans, breaking the siege that had strangled the city for months. That single triumph reignited the flame of French resistance. Her courage became legend even before the battle was over. Soldiers claimed that where her banner flew, they could not be defeated. Under her guidance, Charles VII was crowned king at Reims, a moment so powerful, so symbolic, that it felt as if God himself had restored France's crown. For the English, this was more than defeat, it was humiliation. For the French, it was resurrection. But legends burn bright, and bright flames die fast. In 1430, Joan was captured by Burgundian allies of the English. She was put on trial, accused of heresy, witchcraft, and pride. It was never about justice. It was about destroying her story. The English needed her to be a fraud, a liar, a heretic. They needed to erase the idea that God had chosen France. Joan stood in chains before her judges, a simple girl facing a wall of scholars and priests. Yet even then she refused to yield. Her words were calm, her faith unbroken. She was only 19 when they burned her at the stake, but death didn't silence her, it sanctified her. The flames that consumed her body only spread her legend. In time, the church that condemned her would declare her a saint. The girl who once terrified kings would become the symbol of a nation's soul. These were the figures who defined the 100 Years' War, not just warriors but icons. Edward the Black Prince, the Dark Knight of England, Henry V, the King of Glory and Theatre, Joan of Arc, the Divine Messenger of France. Each of them became a mirror reflecting the hopes, fears, and beliefs of their people. They were living stories molded by victory and tragedy alike, and through them, the war became more than a struggle for land or lineage. It became a struggle for meaning. For every sword raised, there was a name, a myth, a destiny that gave the killing purpose. In their rise and fall, Europe's old world of knights and kings began to give way to something new, a world where the legend could matter more than the man. For more than a century, Europe bled. Behind the banners of kings and the songs of victory lay a darker, quieter truth, the human cost. The 100 Years' War wasn't just a contest of crowns, it was a slow unraveling of an entire world. A world of knights and castles, of peasants bound to the land, of chivalry and faith. A world that would not survive the fire it unleashed upon itself. The chronicles often speak of battles and treaties, of heroes and kings. But what they rarely tell is the story of the ordinary, the farmers, the mothers, the children, the people who lived under the shadow of a war they never chose. For them, the 100 Years' War was not a story of glory. It was a story of hunger, fear, and loss that stretched across generations. Every time a new campaign began, armies marched through villages like a storm. Soldiers took food, burned crops, seized livestock. To the peasants, it didn't matter which flag the invaders carried. English, French, or mercenary, they all brought ruin. Homes were looted, churches defiled, families scattered. The land itself became a casualty, stripped bare and scarred. In some regions, entire towns disappeared. Trade collapsed. Fields that once fed hundreds turned into wastelands overrun by weeds. The great cities, Paris, Rouen, Bordeaux, lived in constant fear of siege. Disease followed the soldiers. The Black Death had already weakened Europe, and the war made it worse. Soldiers carried plague from one region to another, spreading death faster than any army could march. But even as people died, something strange was happening. Out of suffering, Europe was changing. The war was reshaping not only kingdoms, but the very structure of society. For centuries, the world had been ruled by feudal bonds, lords, knights, and vassals tied by loyalty and land. But war demanded more than feudal levies. It required organization, money, supply, and discipline. Kings could no longer rely on nobles to raise armies. They began to build their own, professional, loyal, not to a lord, but to the crown. And so, slowly, the age of the knight began to fade. The armored horsemen who once ruled the battlefield now found themselves obsolete. The English longbowmen had proven that skill and coordination could destroy even the mightiest cavalry. Later, the thunder of gunpowder sealed the knight's fate. Cannons shattered castle walls that had stood for centuries. Arquebuses and hand cannons pierced armor once thought impenetrable. The old code of chivalry, honor, personal valor, single combat couldn't survive in this new world. War had become impersonal, industrial, and cruel. Victory was no longer about courage. It was about logistics, strategy, and technology. The 100 Years' War was the bridge between the medieval and the modern, the crucible that melted old Europe into something new. And yet, even as the battlefield changed, so did the people. The peasants, once voiceless and powerless, began to see their own strength. When the war dragged on and taxes rose, revolts began to spread, first in France, then in England. The most famous of these was the Chivalry in 1308, when French peasants rose against their lords in a desperate fury. They were crushed, but the message was clear: the old order was cracking. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 erupted for similar reasons: war taxes, corruption, and injustice. For the first time, the lower classes dared to speak the language of equality. They shouted that all men were born free, that the same God made peasants and kings alike. Those words would echo for centuries. As the war went on, entire generations grew up, knowing nothing but conflict. Young men were born to fight. Old men died, remembering the peace of their youth. War became a way of life, and its scars ran deep. Families torn apart, villages abandoned, churches burned. Europe became a landscape of ghosts. But out of that devastation, a new awareness began to grow. People began to think differently about power, faith, and identity. They saw that kings were not divine. They were human, fallible, and often cruel. They saw that courage did not always wear armor, that sometimes it wore rags. The church, too, changed. The war had tested its moral authority. Priests had blessed both sides, declaring that God stood with them, a contradiction that bred doubt. The idea that God chose one king over another began to fade. Slowly, the seeds of secular thought, of reason, began to take root. Europe was beginning to awaken from the long sleep of the Middle Ages. Artists, writers, and thinkers would later look back on this century of chaos and see not just destruction, but transformation. They would call it the twilight of the medieval world, the moment when the old ideals of faith and feudalism gave way to the dawn of the Renaissance. The war had torn everything apart, but in doing so, it had cleared the ground for something new. Even warfare itself was never the same again. The 100 Years' War created the first standing armies, disciplined, state-controlled forces that would become the blueprint for every modern nation's military. It gave rise to the concept of national taxation, of organized bureaucracy, of the central power of kings. The feudal lords, once the backbone of medieval politics, found their influence shrinking as monarchs grew stronger. England and France emerged, changed beyond recognition. England, though defeated in France, began to turn inward, focusing on its own identity and stability, a path that would eventually lead to the Wars of the Roses. France, united under a single crown, emerged more centralized, more powerful, and more confident in its national destiny. But while kings and borders were remade, the cost remained etched into the soul of Europe. Entire generations lived under famine and war. Fields once green with harvest became graveyards. Children grew up under the sound of marching armies and the glow of burning towns. The idea of peace became not a state, but a dream. And through it all, a quiet truth began to form. That war was no longer a noble pursuit, no longer the playground of kings seeking glory. It was a machine that consumed everything: faith, wealth, humanity, and left behind only ashes and memory. Because the Hundred Years' War didn't just change who ruled Europe. It changed what Europe was. The medieval dream of honor and divine kingship was dying. In its place, something new was being born, a harsher, more pragmatic world built on reason, order, and nationhood. A world where crowns could be claimed not by blood alone, but by power, will, and the people who believed in them. When the dust of war finally settled in 1453, the world that emerged from the ashes was not the same one that had entered it. The Hundred Years' War had lasted for generations, shaping kings, crushing empires, and redefining what it meant to belong to a nation. What began as a dynastic quarrel between England and France over crowns and inheritance had transformed into something far greater, the birth of modern identity itself. For the first time in European history, the people of England and France began to see themselves not just as subjects of a king, but as part of a nation, a shared destiny, a common home. Before the war, most peasants cared little for royal politics. Their world was their village, their church, their fields. But after a century of conflict, they had fought, bled, and suffered for something larger. They had learned to recognize the idea of France and England as living entities, not just territories, but identities forged in fire. In France, that transformation was most profound. The French crown had started the war weak and fragmented, ruling a land divided among powerful dukes and barons. But through sheer endurance, France emerged united under one monarch, Charles VII, and a newfound sense of purpose. The victory was not merely military, it was spiritual. The French people had reclaimed their land, their pride, and their faith in themselves. And in the heart of that rebirth stood a single figure who came to symbolize it all, a young peasant girl named Joan d'Arc, or as history would remember her, Joan of Arc. Joan's story was not just about religion or bravery, it was about identity. When she stood before Charles and declared that she had been chosen by God to drive out the English, she was giving voice to something the French people had long felt but could not name, a belief that France itself was sacred, a nation worth saving. Her courage inspired soldiers, united nobles, and breathed new life into a war that seemed lost. Her death at the stake in 1431 did not silence her. It canonized her as a symbol of resistance and national faith. Joan of Arc became more than a martyr. She became France. Across the Channel, England faced a different kind of transformation. The war had drained its coffers, devastated its nobility, and left it isolated from the continent. The English dream of empire in France had died. But from that loss came something unexpected, a sense of self-reliance. England began to look inward, redefining its strength not through conquest abroad, but through unity at home. The end of the war planted the seeds of nationalism that would eventually blossom into a powerful English identity. The English language, once seen as inferior to French among the elite, rose in prestige. Literature and law began to flourish in English, not Latin or French. Writers like Geoffrey Chaucer had already begun this shift during the war, but now it accelerated. England was discovering its voice, distinct, proud, and independent. And this shift wasn't just cultural. Politically, the war had reshaped the monarchy itself. The need for massive armies and funding had forced kings to work more closely with their parliaments, giving rise to early ideas of representative governance. England's parliament, once a tool of the crown, began to find its own authority. The war had shown that no king could wage endless conflict without the consent and support of his people. That tension between monarch and parliament would continue to define English politics for centuries to come. Meanwhile, France took the opposite path. The devastation of war had taught its rulers a different lesson, that only a strong, centralized monarchy could protect the realm. Charles VII began rebuilding his kingdom from the ground up, creating a standing army loyal to the crown and instituting national taxes to support it. The feudal lords who once defied royal power found themselves overshadowed by a state that now had true authority. France was no longer a patchwork of duchies. It was a nation unified, sovereign, and reborn from war. But the legacy of the Hundred Years' War went beyond crowns and borders. It changed how people thought about warfare, power, and identity. The age of chivalry was gone. No longer could a few noble knights decide the fate of nations with honor and duels. The war had proven that strength came from the people, from disciplined armies, organized governments, and shared belief. Nationalism had been born not in peace but in pain. The scars of war, however, ran deep. Generations had been lost. Villages destroyed, economies shattered. Yet even in that destruction, Europe found a strange renewal. The technologies developed during the war, from cannons to fortifications, would spark an arms race that pushed military science forward. The centralization of power in both England and France would lay the groundwork for the modern state. In France, the Valois dynasty emerged stronger, paving the way for the splendor of Louis XI and eventually the grandeur of Louis XIV. In England, however, the aftermath of war plunged the nation into internal conflict. The Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil war between rival branches of the royal family, were born from the instability the 100 Years' War had left behind. It was as if England, unable to fight France anymore, turned its sword upon itself. Yet even through that turmoil, the idea of England as a nation endured. Its people had fought together, suffered together, and shared a story that bound them. By the time the Tudors rose to power at the end of the 15th century, that national consciousness had solidified. England would never again be merely a feudal kingdom. It would become a nation-state, one of the first of its kind. And across the sea, France too had entered a new age. United, centralized, and confident, it began to rise as the dominant power of continental Europe. The French monarchy would grow increasingly absolute, but so too would the pride of its people. The very idea of France as a single, indivisible entity, the patrie, the homeland, took root during and after the 100 Years' War. That idea would one day fuel revolutions, inspire poets, and define European politics for centuries. Beyond politics, the war changed culture itself. It inspired chronicles, poems, and songs that tried to make sense of the chaos. Artists began to depict war not as a glorious pursuit, but as tragedy. The rise of realism in art, showing the faces of peasants, the suffering of common people, was part of this shift. Even the way people prayed changed. No longer did they simply ask for the glory of kings, but for peace, for protection, for survival. The 100 Years' War had forced Europe to confront the fragility of human life and the limits of divine order. It taught that faith could not prevent suffering, and that destiny was shaped not by God alone, but by human choice and consequence. In that sense, it was the end of the medieval dream and the beginning of the modern world. Because from the ashes of endless battles and ruined fields, two great nations had risen. England and France, once bound by blood, then divided by war, had found their true identities in opposition to each other. They had become not just kingdoms, but symbols. Two mirrors reflecting the evolution of power, faith, and pride. And though the 100 Years' War had ended, the rivalry it created would echo through history, from the battlefields of Agincourt to the wars of Napoleon, from the Age of Empire to the world wars of the 20th century. The conflict that began over a crown had ended by creating the very idea of nationhood. The 100 Years' War didn't just change who ruled. It changed what it meant to rule, what it meant to belong, and what it meant to be part of something greater than a king. It was not only a war for land, but a war for identity, for the birth of England and France as we know them today. And so, as the echoes of battle fade into the mist of history, the 100 Years' War stands not just as one of Europe's longest and bloodiest conflicts, but as one of its most transformative. What began as a feud over crowns ended as a revolution of identity, reshaping the very foundations of power, faith, and belonging. From the ashes of burned villages and broken kingdoms emerged two nations reborn. France rose united, its monarchy stronger and its people bound by a shared destiny. England, though it lost its lands across the Channel, discovered something far greater: itself. The war taught both sides that true strength lies not only in armies and armor, but in unity, purpose, and the will of a people to endure. The knights who once ruled the battlefield gave way to soldiers of nations. The ideals of divine kingship gave way to reason and governance. And the voices of peasants, long silenced by feudal order, began to whisper of equality, of freedom, of change. The Hundred Years' War, in all its chaos, became the crucible from which the modern world was forged. Its legacy stretches far beyond the 14th and 15th centuries. The rivalries it sparked shaped centuries of politics, culture, and identity. The language of nationalism, the birth of centralized power, the dawn of standing armies, all trace their roots to this struggle between England and France. In the end, the Hundred Years' War was not merely a story of kings, but of people. It was not just about who wore the crown, but about how the world itself learned to think beyond it. Out of its fire, the medieval world died, and a new age began. An age where nations, not monarchs, would define the destiny of humankind. And perhaps in the ruins of that endless war, history left us its greatest lesson, that even in the darkest centuries of conflict, humanity's enduring struggle is not for conquest, but for identity, to know who we are, and what we stand for when the smoke finally clears.